Robert Redford, the man whose silence spoke louder than 1,000 lines. He lost 2 sons, endured the weight of fame, and built a legacy not with noise, but with grace. This is not the story of a movie star. It's the story of a man who walked through grief, gave without asking, and disappeared just as quietly as he lived. To understand who Robert Redford really was, we must go back not to the red carpets, but to the shadows behind them. This is his journey, chapter by chapter. Long before Robert Redford stood beneath the blinding lights of Hollywood, before the Oscars, the headlines, the legacy, he stood in silence, holding a tiny coffin. His first child, Scott Anthony Redford, was born in 1959, a baby boy with a soft face and fragile heartbeat. For a few fleeting weeks, Redford believed he had everything: a young marriage, a new baby, and a dream just beginning to bloom. But then, with no warning, death came quietly. Sudden infant death syndrome, a name as cruel as it is vague. No explanation, no answers. Just silence and a void that swallowed him whole. He was only 22, still trying to figure out the weight of adulthood, when he was forced to carry the weight no parent should ever know, burying a child. In public, he remained composed. In interviews, decades later, he would barely speak of Scott. But his friends said his eyes told the story. That something inside him had cracked, not loudly, not all at once, but in the kind of quiet that never heals. In the shadows of his smile, in the spaces between his words, the ache of that loss lingered like a ghost. It was this invisible grief that bled into his art. Watch him closely in his earliest roles. The quiet intensity, the restrained rage, the simmering sorrow under the surface. Redford didn't have to fake pain. He carried it in his bones. He didn't cry on screen for the audience. He cried because he had lived something the world could never fully understand. That loss was not just personal. It became formative. A private storm that shaped how he viewed the world, the fragility of life, and the shallowness of fame. While other young actors chased glitter, Redford chased meaning. While others craved applause, he craved silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. In many ways, Scott never left him. Redford carried him into every role, every frame, every line of dialogue. The baby he couldn't save became the heartbreak he refused to waste. He once admitted, "It hardens you, but it also opens you. You become aware of life's edge, and you never forget that it's always right there under your feet." This was the moment the world didn't see, but it was the one that defined him. Behind every classic Redford performance is a father's quiet grief. Not as a scar, but as a compass. It didn't make him famous. It made him real. And in a world that worships legends, that first tragedy made him something far rarer human. The world adored his face before they ever heard his voice. Golden hair, piercing blue eyes, that effortless jawline, Robert Redford was by every Hollywood standard a sculpted dream. Directors noticed. So did casting agents. But what they saw wasn't an actor. It was a commodity, a type. The charming golden boy, the handsome stranger, the man who'd never tasted real pain. Redford's beauty became his curse. He was offered roles that required smiles, not soul, looks, not layers. He heard the same words repeated across auditions. "You're too pretty to be serious," or worse, "You don't look like someone who's ever suffered." What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was the young man who had already buried a son, lost his mother too soon, and stumbled through exile in Europe with nothing but sketchbooks and broken dreams. But none of that fit into their frame. They saw a poster. He was living a funeral. In private, Redford was conflicted. He understood the privilege of his appearance. He didn't deny its power. but he resented the prison it created. The idea that beauty negates depth, that pain, if it doesn't show in wrinkles or scars, must not be real. He once reflected, "Being attractive opens doors, but it also locks you in. People stop looking further. They assume there's nothing behind the glass." So he fought back quietly, deliberately. He turned down roles that felt empty. He took acting lessons. He studied painters, poets, damaged people. He immersed himself in storytelling, not just to perform, but to prove he had something to say. Yet the stereotypes lingered, even after his breakout roles Barefoot in the Park, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid. The Way We Were critics still questioned his depth. Audiences adored him, but Hollywood insiders whispered, "He's all surface, no soul." It cut deep. Not just because it undermined his craft, but because it erased his grief. As if beauty canceled out sorrow. As if a man could not be both luminous and lost. And so he made a choice, a quiet rebellion to carry that weight into his work. To make every character a Trojan horse, beautiful on the outside, but trembling on the inside. To hide real wounds behind charming smiles, to smuggle pain past Hollywood's gatekeepers. It worked. Not all at once, not loudly. But over decades, Redford turned beauty into something else: a mirror, a canvas, a decoy. Behind that perfect face was a man who had been judged, dismissed, and underestimated, and who chose to let the silence speak louder than the skin. In the end, his beauty may have built the frame, but it was his brokenness that painted the picture. Before there were cameras, before there was grief, there was her. Robert Redford's mother, Martha Hart, wasn't a star, but she was the first person who ever believed he could shine. When he was just a small boy in Santa Monica, fragile and often sickly, it was Martha who stayed up through the nights. It was Martha who massaged his limbs, who told him he'd run again, who whispered strength into a body battling childhood polio. To him, she was invincible. She didn't just raise him, she resurrected him. Redford would later say that the kind of resilience his characters showed on screen came from her. Not his father, not school, not any teacher or mentor, but from the woman who knelt beside his bed when he couldn't stand. She was quiet, but unshakable, soft, but unrelenting. While others taught him to act, she taught him to survive. But survival, it seems, had its price. Just as he stepped into adulthood, barely 18, filled with restlessness and rebellion, she was gone. A sudden, shocking death. No long illness, no final words. One day, she was there folding laundry and making tea. The next, she was a memory, a void, a silence deeper than any role he'd ever play. And that silence would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was on the verge of everything college manhood. Artistic awakening, but her absence derailed it all. He dropped out of school. He began drinking. He drifted first into depression, then across Europe in a haze of uncertainty and half-finished sketches. The world saw a young man wandering with paintbrushes and wine bottles. What they didn't see was a son looking for a mother who would never come back. Her death wasn't just a heartbreak, it was a rupture. The last anchor cut loose. For the second time in his life, Redford lost the one person who had made the unbearable feel bearable. In his later years, when asked about that period, he rarely spoke in specifics. But he once admitted, "When she died, something inside me snapped loose. It took years before I realized I'd been searching for her in every country, every woman, every stage I walked onto." And perhaps that's why so many of his most iconic characters carry a quiet ache, a longing just beneath the surface. They're men who've seen too much lost too early and learned to live without closure, just like him. Robert Redford didn't become a legend by accident. He became one by surviving the loss of his roots and building something new in their place. His mother gave him life, then left him with the impossible task of learning to live it alone. And he did. With silence, with grace, with grief woven into every frame. After his mother's sudden death, Robert Redford didn't fall apart. He fell away. He left America behind not in triumph, but in retreat. One semester at the University of Colorado ended in expulsion, the result of too many nights blurred by alcohol and too little reason to stay. He had lost his compass, and when you don't know who you are, the world becomes a map of possible identities. So he bought a one-way ticket to Europe, France, Italy, Spain, cities that existed in black and white postcards and paintings, streets where no one knew his name. He didn't go to become someone. He went to disappear. He wandered through Paris with sketch pads in his coat pockets and more questions than belongings. In Florence, he studied art, but not for degrees or galleries. He studied because the silence of a museum was the only silence that didn't hurt. In the mornings, he scribbled faces in charcoal. At night, he traded meals for wine cigarettes and the occasional bed in a stranger's apartment. Europe wasn't glamorous. It was survival. He drifted through cafe terraces and train stations, his hands covered in ink and paint. Sometimes he worked as a janitor. Other times, he simply didn't eat. He spoke little. He listened much. He drew faces he'd never see again. Old men with stories in their wrinkles. Women who smoked like they were burning memories. The loneliness was staggering, but so was the freedom. This was where he began to understand character, not as performance, but as pain. He met war survivors, exiles, street poets. He saw beauty and sorrow braided together in ways that Hollywood never taught. He began to write letters, stories, even screen ideas. The artist in him was waking up not through applause, but through hunger. But even in those foreign streets, the ghosts followed. His mother's absence, his son's brief existence, the feeling that no place, no country, no canvas could ever be home again. He chased purpose like smoke, sketching his grief onto napkins and notebooks, trying to outrun the shadows inside him. And yet somehow, in that blur of foreign languages and unfamiliar skies, something slowly returned the will to rebuild. The courage to come back, to try again. By the time he returned to New York, he wasn't healed, but he was ready to begin. He had no agent, no fame, just a bag full of drawings, a few dollars, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for him in the world. A place not to escape his pain, but to use it. When Robert Redford returned from Europe, the city that awaited him wasn't paved with promises. It was cold, chaotic, and indifferent. New York City in the late 1950s didn't care that he had lost a child, a mother, or his way. It was a city built for survivors, and now Redford had to prove he was one. He had no contacts, no money, just a stubborn belief that somewhere in the chaos there was a stage with his name on it. He lived in cramped apartments with walls thin enough to hear dreams shatter in the room next door. Rent was often overdue. Meals were skipped more often than not. Breakfast was coffee. Dinner was whatever he could afford after a shift moving furniture or unloading trucks. Sometimes he sketched portraits in Washington Square Park for coins. Other times he painted sets for off-Broadway theaters just for a chance to watch from the wings. And through it all, he studied. He trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. He absorbed the craft of performance like oxygen, starving for every word, every gesture, every nuance. He wasn't just acting, he was surviving. Every audition felt like a battleground. He was too handsome, too quiet, too unconventional. Some directors wanted his face, but not his voice. Others dismissed him before he even read a line. He kept hearing the same phrase, "You don't look like someone who knows pain." If only they knew. But rejection didn't break him. It sharpened him. His hunger, both literal and emotional, became part of his performances. The young men he played on stage weren't polished or perfect. They were uncertain, restless, bruised by life, just like him. He took small roles, television parts, commercial gigs, stage plays in damp basements with flickering lights. Nothing paid well, but in every performance he poured the full weight of his journey, the loss, the exile, the silence, the sketchbooks, the nights alone in a city that never cared. And slowly, something began to shift. Audiences noticed. Critics began to whisper. There was something in this young man's eyes, not just talent, but truth. A kind of restrained intensity that couldn't be faked. He wasn't playing at suffering. He had lived it. It wasn't fame yet, but it was a beginning. Redford later said those were the most important years of his life, not because of the roles, but because of what he learned, that you don't need applause to be an artist. You only need the courage to keep showing up even when no one's looking, especially when no one's looking. Because in those silent, hungry years, Robert Redford didn't just become an actor. He became a man who would never forget what it cost to chase a dream when you have nothing left to lose. Success didn't come with celebration. It came with suspicion. When Robert Redford finally began to break through, first on stage, then on screen, the applause came wrapped in condescension. With his first major Broadway role in Barefoot in the Park, he charmed audiences and proved his comic timing. Then came television and finally film. He was no longer invisible. But now he was something else misunderstood. Hollywood didn't know what to make of him. Yes, he had presence. Yes, he could act. But still, critics whispered, "Isn't he just a pretty face?" Industry gatekeepers looked at his golden hair and square jaw and couldn't imagine depth. To them, pain needed wrinkles. Complexity needed darkness. And Redford, clean-cut All-American, seemed like a product, not a person. This wasn't just vanity, it was erasure. The years of struggle, the losses he buried in silence, the sketches made in Paris cafes, the hunger-fueled auditions in New York basements, none of that fit their narrative. They didn't see the boy who buried his son, the son who lost his mother, the man who crawled through rejection not to be adored, but to be heard. And that hurt more than being unknown. Because now he was visible and still unseen. Even as his fame skyrocketed with films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and The Sting, Redford carried a quiet rage. He knew he was being underestimated, not by fans they adored him, but by the very people who claimed to understand cinema. To them, he was charming, bankable, safe. But Redford didn't want to be safe. He wanted to be true. So he began choosing roles that cracked the surface. He played wounded lovers, reluctant heroes, men torn between ideals and reality. He leaned into quiet performances, ones where the emotion lived behind the eyes, in the silences, in what wasn't said. Off-screen, he worked even harder to be taken seriously. He got involved in production. He challenged scripts. He fought to attach his name to projects that mattered even if the studios pushed back. Still, the label clung to him like a shadow. Too handsome to hurt. It was a beautiful lie, and a cruel one. But Redford didn't lash out. He let the work speak. He once said, "The biggest challenge in this industry isn't failure, it's being misunderstood. And staying steady anyway." And that's what he did. For decades, While others faded or cracked under the weight of fame, Redford carved out a career defined by restraint, by quiet integrity, by the refusal to let anyone else define him. The world saw the beauty, but Redford never let them forget that beneath the smile was a man who had been dismissed, doubted, and disbelieved, and who rose anyway. By the early 1980s, Robert Redford had everything Hollywood claimed to value: fame, wealth, and a resume filled with box office hits. But none of it felt complete. He was respected, yes. Admired, absolutely. But somewhere deep within, the ache remained. He had played the romantic lead, the outlaw hero, the tragic heartthrob. But now he wanted something more. Something behind the camera. Something that would let him not just act, but shape. And so, for his directorial debut, he chose a story not of glamour, but of grief. Ordinary People wasn't a blockbuster. It didn't have explosions or iconic one-liners. It was a slow, raw, intimate portrait of a family shattered by loss and the silence that followed. It was the kind of story Redford had lived in fragments. A boy who lost his mother too soon. A father who lost a son before he even had a chance to dream. A man who spent decades learning how to live with the ache no one could see. Redford didn't direct from theory. He directed from memory. He understood what it meant to be hollowed out by tragedy. He understood how grief isolates, how families fracture in silence, how pain lingers in polite dinner table conversations, and how healing often hides behind awkward everyday moments. Critics were stunned. Audiences felt something they hadn't expected: a whisper of themselves in the story. The performances were haunting. The direction was meticulous, unflashy, and painfully human. Then came the Oscars. Ordinary People won Best Picture. Redford won Best Director. In one night, the industry that once reduced him to his looks was forced to confront his mind and his heart. But for Redford, the award wasn't validation. It was something quieter, a turning point, a nod from fate. He had spent decades being underestimated, being told he was too pretty, too soft, too commercially clean to carry true weight. But in telling a story about grief and guilt, a story without the crutch of his own face on screen, he proved that his soul had always been the sharpest tool in the room. And he didn't stop there. From that moment on, Redford began using his influence to tell stories that mattered. Stories that might never have seen the light of day without someone like him behind the scenes. He wasn't building a brand. He was building a space for voices like his, used to be unseen, unheard, unproven. Redford's transition from actor to director wasn't a career move. It was a reclamation. It was proof that beneath the beauty behind the roles and beyond the fame, there was always a storyteller waiting for the world to listen. And finally, they did. By the time Robert Redford became a household name, he was more than just an actor. He was an icon, a symbol, a face that defined generations. But beneath the glimmer of fame was a truth rarely spoken. The spotlight that shines brightest also burns the deepest. Redford had spent decades crafting his identity, not just as a performer, but as a man of integrity, an artist of substance. And when Ordinary People earned him the Oscar, it wasn't just a win, it was a signal. He had crossed a threshold, from actor to auteur, from star to institution. But institutions can't breathe, and symbols aren't allowed to stumble. Suddenly, everything he did or didn't do became part of a public script he couldn't edit. The world no longer looked at him. They watched him, waiting, expecting, demanding. And Redford felt it. He once described fame not as a gift, but as a trap. The more visible you become, he said, the less room you have to move. Every word was analyzed, every pause misinterpreted, every wrinkle dissected by tabloids hunting for decay. He had built a fortress of excellence, but now he was expected to live inside it. And that kind of pressure doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It builds. It tightens its grip slowly until even the smallest mistake feels catastrophic. He couldn't walk down the street without being recognized, couldn't grieve privately, couldn't grow older without the world asking what happened to the man from The Way We Were. Even joy became filtered through scrutiny. When he laughed, people asked if it was sincere. When he fell in love, headlines questioned if it was real. When he stayed silent, they filled in the blanks. Somewhere along the way, the man who had once sought peace in sketchbooks and quiet roles became a prisoner of his own persona. But Redford didn't explode. He didn't retreat in scandal or bitterness. Instead, he learned to bend. He created boundaries, guarded his private life with fierce resolve, chose projects that mattered rather than those that sold. He let the noise surround him, but never seep into him. And in doing so, he modeled something rare in Hollywood: quiet endurance. Because being famous is one thing. Staying whole within that fame, that's a different kind of courage. Redford never craved the spotlight. He simply refused to let it blind him. And in an industry obsessed with attention, he reminded us that true power sometimes lies not in being seen, but in choosing how, when, and why you let the world look in. If Robert Redford had only ever acted, he would still be remembered. But Redford never measured greatness by how bright his own name shone. Instead, he asked a rarer question: how many others can I help shine? And so he built something not for himself, but for the ones who had been told no, for the outsiders, the unpolished, the uninvited. He built Sundance. In 1981, nestled in the quiet mountains of Utah, far from the noise and glitter of Los Angeles, Redford founded the Sundance Institute. At the time, Hollywood was booming with blockbuster sequels and predictable formulas. But Redford saw what others ignored: a generation of storytellers with something to say, and nowhere to say it. These weren't industry darlings. They were first-time filmmakers, women, people of color, experimental voices, dreamers who couldn't afford the price of admission into Hollywood's elite circles. Sundance gave them a stage. But more than that, it gave them permission. Permission to take risks, to tell the truth, to create stories that didn't follow formulas. Redford's vision was simple, yet revolutionary. Art isn't only for the powerful, it's for the brave. Under his guidance, Sundance became more than a festival. It became a movement. It launched the careers of directors like Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, Ava DuVernay, Chloe Zhao, and countless others who once stood where Redford had stood decades earlier, alone, broke and desperate to be seen not as a product, but as an artist. And Redford never asked for the spotlight. In fact, he actively stepped away from it. He rarely placed himself front and center at the festival. He didn't want Sundance to become about him. He wanted it to be about everyone else. That humility became the foundation of its power. In a world where fame often serves itself, Redford used his name as a bridge. His fame didn't build a monument. It built a home for lost voices, forgotten scripts, and unpolished dreams. He once said, "The best thing I could do with my success was to pass it on." And that's exactly what he did. Today, Sundance stands as one of the most respected film institutions in the world. But its true legacy isn't in the awards or premieres. It's in the quiet revolution it sparked: a reminder that every voice deserves a chance to echo, no matter how small, strange, or silent it may seem. Robert Redford may have been the face of a generation, but through Sundance, he became its shelter. Some wounds never fully heal. They just wait silent, buried until they're opened again. Decades after the loss of his firstborn son, Robert Redford was forced to relive a parent's worst nightmare. His second son, James Redford, known to many as Jamie, was born in 1962 with a rare liver disease. From the moment he entered the world, he was fighting for his life. Redford, now a rising star, should have been celebrating career highs. Instead, he found himself pacing hospital corridors once again, watching monitors instead of movies, holding on to hope with white knuckles. Jamie survived childhood, but the illness never left. It loomed over every year, every achievement, every smile. And yet Jamie grew into a gentle, thoughtful man, a filmmaker, an activist, a father. He chose storytelling too, but not for glory. Like his father, he believed in voices that healed in truth over spectacle. He made documentaries about the environment, education, and the invisible wounds people carry. For Robert, Jamie was proof that resilience could be inherited, but also so could fragility. In 1993, Jamie underwent a liver transplant, then another, and another. The body fought. The soul endured. But behind the scenes, Redford was watching his son wither under the same cruel weight that had once taken Scott. In 2020, Jamie Redford passed away after a long battle with cancer linked to his ongoing liver complications. He was 58, and Robert, now in his 80s, had to say goodbye. Again, no cameras, no interviews, just grief. Deep, devastating déjà vu. To lose one child is unthinkable. To lose two is inhumane. Yet Redford bore it all in silence, as he always had. He didn't use it for sympathy. He didn't write memoirs or give weeping speeches, but his silence spoke volumes. Those close to him say it changed him, softened him even more. As if some part of him, already familiar with the edge of heartbreak, now simply surrendered to its tide. He was no longer a man carrying a tragedy. He was a man shaped by it. But even then, Redford turned pain into purpose. In Jamie's honor, the James Redford Institute for Transplant Awareness was created. Films were funded. Conversations were started. Lives were saved. Because that's what Redford does. He doesn't build walls around his pain. He builds bridges with it, so others don't have to walk the same lonely path. He once said, "The measure of our life isn't in what we've achieved, but in what we've endured and how we use it to lift others." 2 sons, 2 tragedies, 2 pieces of his soul now lost to time. But even broken Robert Redford continued forward, proving that the human spirit, though shattered, can still rise. Not untouched, but unafraid. Long before red carpets and studio lots, before the word legend ever brushed his name, Robert Redford was just a young man in love. He met Lola Van Wagenen in Los Angeles during the early 1950s, a smart, independent-minded woman from a conservative Mormon background. He was rebellious, artistic, emotionally bruised. She was thoughtful, grounded, and steady. And together, they found something rare: refuge. They married in 1958, when Redford was still unknown, broke, and uncertain about everything except her. Their love wasn't built on fame. It was built on survival. Through poverty, grief, and his early failures, Lola was his constant. She stood by him through the loss of their first child, through the nomadic years of trying to make it in New York, through the chaos of early fame. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't chasing lights, but she helped him find his. Together, they had 4 children. Together, they built a life far from the Hollywood spotlight, often retreating to Utah, where nature could quiet the noise. For a time, it seemed unshakable. But fame doesn't just change the person at the center. It changes the air around them. And slowly, the world began to intrude. Redford's career exploded in the 1970s. His face was everywhere. Every role, every premiere, every magazine cover widened the gap between the quiet man and the quiet life they had built. Still, they endured. For nearly 3 decades, they tried, loved, rebuilt. But some cracks don't scream, they spread in silence. And in 1985, after 27 years of marriage, they quietly divorced. No scandal, no public feud, no tell-all memoirs or bitter interviews. Just silence, the kind that only comes when 2 people who once fought together do quietly let go. And yet Redford never spoke ill of Lola. In fact, he rarely spoke of her at all, not because she didn't matter, but because she always did. In interviews when pressed, he simply called her the love of my life. Even decades later, that phrase never changed. Their story isn't told with fireworks. It isn't measured by how it ended, but by how much they endured together. The griefs shared, the children raised, the loyalty that held even as love evolved. In a world addicted to messy endings and dramatic breakups, Redford and Lola left quietly but respectfully, like 2 travelers who once walked side by side through fire and then at a fork in the road gently parted ways. Their love didn't end with a bang. It simply rested. And for a man who knew the weight of silence, that was perhaps the most honest kind of goodbye. After Lola, the world assumed Robert Redford would remarry quickly. He was still handsome, still powerful, still the man whose eyes once captivated the screen and softened the edges of even the hardest roles. But what the world didn't see, couldn't see, was how deeply his first love had marked him. He wasn't chasing romance, he was avoiding repetition. Over the decades that followed, Redford was linked to many actresses, artists, intellectuals, women drawn not just to his fame, but to the quiet beneath it. There was the fiery brilliance of Sonia Braga, the elegant mystique of Lena Olin, and a long list of rumored companions who floated around him like passing seasons. But none stayed, and not because they weren't worthy. It was Redford who pulled away. He had learned perhaps too well how loss could sneak into love, that the more you opened, the more you risked breaking. That even the most beautiful connection could end with a silence too sharp to name. So he kept his heart guarded, not out of arrogance, but out of grief. Friends noticed. He was present, generous, kind, but rarely surrendered fully. The actor who had made the world believe in fairy tale love, who made us weep in the way we were, and ache in Out of Africa, had become in life a man who loved cautiously. There were moments, bright, fleeting joys, quiet companionships. But he never gave the world another Lola. That door once closed, stayed closed for a long time. And maybe that was his way of protecting the sacred. Redford never turned his back on love. He simply stopped chasing its permanence. Instead, he embraced what it could be. Temporary, imperfect, worth it, even if it wouldn't last. In interviews, he was polite but evasive about his relationships. When asked about his status, he smiled and said, "I've learned not to speak on what's still being written." Because for him, love wasn't a headline. It was a quiet chapter. One he refused to have rewritten by anyone else's pen. What remains most striking is not the names on the list, but how gently he treated them. No public shaming, no bitterness. Just an artist who understood that some people arrive to teach us, to heal us, to walk beside us for a time, and then they leave. Not every love has to last forever to be worth remembering. And Robert Redford, shaped by absence, taught us that even the loves that didn't stay could still leave behind light. After decades of guarding his heart, of walking through fame like a ghost in his own spotlight, Robert Redford finally let someone in. Not a co-star, not a Hollywood insider, but an artist like him, who knew how to speak in silence and paint with feeling. Her name was Sibylle Sagars, a German-born painter whose work whispered rather than shouted. Where others saw only the legend, she saw the man. Where others expected Redford to perform, she invited him to simply be. Their connection was quiet, but immediate, not rushed, not loud, and not for show. She brought with her the rhythm of nature, the patience of color, the calm of rain. And Redford, a man made of restraint, allowed himself to soften. Together, they found healing in stillness, in long walks beneath Utah skies, in the wordless collaboration of two artists who didn't need translation. She wasn't an echo of his past. She was the rain after a long drought. Their most profound union came not in words, but in creation. They co-founded The Way of the Rain, a multidisciplinary art project blending visual art, music performance, and the environment. It was more than a show. It was a spiritual offering, an attempt to reconnect people to the earth, to each other, and to the fragile balance we so often forget. Through it, Redford stepped out of his cinematic shadow and into something even more intimate. Not a performance, not a role, but a conversation with the sky, with the land, with the woman who showed him that art could be medicine. Sibylle didn't try to erase his past. She honored it. She knew she wasn't his first love. She didn't need to be. What mattered was that in the final chapters of his life, Redford was no longer alone with his sorrow. He had found someone who didn't want the myth, just the man. They married in 2009, but their bond had long preceded the ceremony. And as the years passed, the world watched Robert Redford, the lone cowboy, the grieving father, the silent warrior, finally allow himself joy. Not as spectacle, but as sanctuary. He once said of Sibylle, "She gave me peace in a world that never allowed it." And maybe that's what love looks like when it arrives late. Not fireworks or declarations, but shelter. A hand to hold when the lights go down. A storm that doesn't destroy, but renews. She didn't save him. She reminded him that even cracked earth can bloom again. No flashbulbs, no headlines, no final scene written by Hollywood's hand. On September 16, 2025, in the golden hush of early autumn, Robert Redford, the man who once embodied the very soul of American cinema, passed away quietly at his secluded home in Utah. He was 89 years old. There were no hospitals, no sterile walls, just the soft creak of pine wood floors, the smell of rain on desert rock, and the low hum of wind brushing past the windows. The same elements that had comforted him for decades now bore witness to his final breath. He did not fear the end. Friends said he had grown more contemplative in his last years, as if reviewing his life not with regret, but with reverence. He often sat on the porch with Sibylle by his side, watching storms roll in over the Wasatch Mountains, saying little, asking for nothing. In those moments, he didn't seem like a man preparing to leave the world, but a man finally at peace with it. He had lost 2 sons, a marriage, friends. He had carried the weight of expectations and the ache of misunderstanding. And still, he chose dignity, stillness, integrity. In his final days, he declined interviews, tributes, retrospectives, not out of bitterness, but because he never wanted to become a spectacle. He had given the world enough. The camera had taken what it needed. Now he asked only for quiet. There was no press conference, no televised tribute, just a simple statement from his family. And the sound of millions of hearts breaking, not with shock, but with a reverence reserved only for the truly irreplaceable. For decades, Redford had defined how masculinity could be soft, how silence could speak, how pain could be worn without shame. And in death, he redefined something else, how a legend leaves. There was no parade, no spotlight, just a breath. Then, silence. And maybe that's how it was always meant to end, not in grandeur, but in grace. He did not belong to Hollywood. Not really. He belonged to the wild, to the rain, to the broken, and the brave. His home in Utah was never just a retreat, it was a statement. That fame should serve life, not consume it. And there, beneath the mountains he once painted in oils and filmed in 35mm, Robert Redford returned to the earth he loved, not as a star, but as a man. When the lights faded and the world stopped watching, Robert Redford remained. Not as a star on a screen, but as something quieter, stronger, and infinitely more human. He was never the loudest man in the room. He never needed to be. He didn't speak in grand gestures or dramatic exits. He moved through life with a rare stillness, a dignity that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect. His legacy was never just about the roles he played. It was in the silences between those roles, in the grief he carried with grace, in the way he turned personal pain into universal poetry. He lost a child before he became a household name. He lost another at the peak of his influence. And yet, he never used his sorrow for sympathy. He simply folded it into his work, into his gaze, into his direction. He was called too beautiful to be deep, too quiet to lead, too gentle for greatness. And every time, without raising his voice, he proved them wrong. He became a voice for those who had none. He built Sundance not to celebrate himself, but to lift others, the outsiders, the overlooked, the storytellers who reminded him of the boy he once was. And when it was his time to go, he didn't announce it. He didn't script his final moment. He passed away just as he had lived, far from the noise, beneath a quiet Utah sky, beside the woman who brought him peace, surrounded by the land he loved. No spotlights, no speeches, just the wind, just the mountains, just a final breath that carried more weight than any final line could ever hold. Because Redford understood what few in this world ever truly grasp. That greatness isn't found in how loudly you live, but in how deeply. And if that truth touches you, if something in his story lingers even after this video ends, then let it live on. Like this video, not for clicks, but for the kind of legacy that deserves to be remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments, your favorite role, your memory, your moment. And subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade, where we honor not just the careers, but the quiet courage behind them. Because legends like Redford don't disappear. They echo. They whisper through the stories they've told, through the lives they've touched, through the silence they leave behind. And in that silence, they live forever.